Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be discussing some of the recent discoveries in regards to the origins of complex life on planet Earth, and specifically a major breakthrough coming from Australia in helping us understand how pretty much everything around us, including me and you, potentially began. And that's because, based on some of the research from the last few decades, a lot of biologists believe that complex life very likely arose as a result of a kind of a symbiosis between bacteria and other complex cells. But the problem was that this was mostly a theory or a hypothesis, and there was always a kind of a missing link between simple bacteria and much more complex cells, such as eukaryotic cells, that all of us are made out of. And so biologists have never actually seen this in action, until basically extremely recently. And so to find some of these answers, we actually have to travel to a location that most of us have probably never heard of. The location in Western Australia that's actually a World Heritage Site. This is known as Gathaagudu, a location off the coast of Western Australia that's also sometimes referred to as the Shark Bay. And here this place is very important for one very specific structure that's actually extremely rare on our planet. This location is home to stromatolites, layered mounds of microbial life that basically resemble rocks but are actually living relics of ecosystem from billions of years ago. And though these have been discovered in other locations like near Saudi Arabia, the study about which we've discussed in one of the videos in the description, normally these are actually kind of rare, but are super important for understanding the evolution of complex life. And in essence, these are microbial mats, or basically a collection of different microbes living together, forming these enormous communities. And they're also oxygen factories. In fact, some of the first bubbles of oxygen that filled Earth's early atmosphere most likely came from the ancestors of very similar structures. So in some sense, you could say that we owe our existence to a lot of these somewhat strange looking rocks. But the most recent discovery is not really about oxygen or how these microbes breathe, but about genealogy of our greatest microbial ancestor. The genealogy of so-called archaea. Technically, these are not bacteria and not eukaryotic cells, but are something slightly different and possibly something in between. But to understand this research and why it's so important, let's briefly talk about our cells, eukaryotes. And so here, all plants, animals, fungi, and a lot of single-cell organisms we usually find in ponds are what's known as eukaryotes. Basically, our cells have complex parts, including nucleus and mitochondria, and a lot of structures that bacteria do not possess. And for many decades, the explanation for this was the idea known as endosymbiosis, or symbiogenesis. Basically, 2 billion years ago, some kind of a simple bacteria, possibly joined with some kind of an archaea, merging into a single cell and becoming a kind of a proto-eukaryote. And so basically, instead of eating the bacteria, the archaea formed a partnership with it, with the bacterium eventually becoming our mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell that provides a lot of energy, but also seems to control our bodies in a lot of other ways. You can learn about this in one of the videos in the description. And so not so long ago, less than a decade ago, completely by accident, researchers discovered a potential host of this initial relationship. That's the Asgard archaea you see right here. And a lot of these microbes were actually named after the Norse gods, such as Loki, Odin, and Thor, mostly because they were discovered near a hydrothermal vent referred to as the Loki's Castle. It's actually very close to Norway, so essentially naming in this case made a lot of sense. And what makes them special is that they do carry a lot of eukaryotic signature proteins and a lot of additional genes that bacteria do not have, but our cells seem to contain as well. And so, for example, proteins for moving the cell membranes and transporting materials that we once thought only complex cells could do. But while scientists have known about these Asgard archaea for at least a few years now, they essentially are just a little bit too difficult to study in the lab. Mostly because they grow incredibly slowly and usually depend on other organisms for survival. Which basically means that a lot of this was still somewhat hypothetical, and there was no actual evidence that any of this could have happened. And so this is where the team of researchers, including the associate professor Brennan Burns, decided to focus on. They spent 5 years nurturing these microbes and essentially tried to grow them inside the lab based on the samples collected from the Shark Bay. In other words, they tried to recreate all of this in lab conditions in order to find some kind of an evidence for this endosymbiosis hypothesis. And in this new study published in April of 2026, they have now revealed that they were able to successfully enrich a novel species of Asgard archaeon that you can kind of see in this picture. They also named this, okay, let me try this. This is going to be a tough one. Archaeum marumarumaye, with the word marumarumaye coming from the local tribal language that basically means ancient home, which basically is what they're trying to recreate here. They're trying to recreate the ancient home of complex life. And so this is where things get a little bit interesting. Here, by using extremely sensitive 3D imaging techniques, something referred to as electron cryotomography, scientists were able to witness something we've never seen before: the first contact between an Asgard archaeon and a bacterium. And specifically, these images show us that the two organisms were physically interacting through very tiny thread-like structures referred to as nanotubes. In other words, here we have the first ever evidence for an actual symbiosis between archaea, and specifically Asgard archaea, and bacteria. But here these microbes were not just touching, they were cooperating. And that's because here, by using genetic sequencing, scientists determined that they seem to be sharing nutrients, including vitamins. Specifically here, the archaea produced things that bacterium needed, and the bacterium returned the favor, which directly reflects the hypothesized partnership that we believe formed the very first complex cells. So it's kind of like the Shakespearean Romeo and Juliet, where two different families of microbes decided to break tradition and live together. Although, wait, in the Shakespearean story, I think they both die. Here, though, they didn't. And so I guess the question is, why exactly does this matter? Well, this Australian discovery is a huge deal because it provides the first visual model and actual evidence for how complex life might have started on a primitive Earth. And so even though for a very long time we only had DNA evidence, or basically just some of the genes that we seem to share, now we can physically see the cellular machinery in action and how most of this began. And it also confirms that life didn't just evolve through competition, but in most cases through extremely complex cooperation. And so without this specific microbial marriage, complex life as we know it would have never existed. Although naturally where this happened is of course currently unknown. But based on some of the other studies, we might start making some conclusions based on what's been discovered in a lot of extreme environments on the planet. So this is not the only study on the evolution of life and the beginning of complex life, with some of the other recent research investigating at least two potential places where all of this could have begun, with the two most likely locations being either the deep-sea hydrothermal vents or possibly land-based hot springs. So for example, at least one recent study discovered that minerals called iron sulfides inside of these hot springs seem to trigger chemical reactions that produce methanol, one of the main building blocks of life, which obviously provides a kind of a link between geochemistry and early biology. And so here when it comes to the cradle of complex life on Earth, a lot of research points at some of the most extreme environments with high pressure and high temperature, such as the previously mentioned Loki's Castle, with many of these systems providing all of the essential ingredients for a prebiotic chemistry: heat that drives complex chemical reactions, minerals that are needed for the development, and longevity in a sense that many of these systems can remain active for thousands or even millions of years. But more intriguingly, at least one other study even suggests that many of these locations could have started naturally as a result of asteroid impacts. Or basically when a very large rock hits the planet, because it creates intense heat and intense pressure, it can actually form hydrothermal systems in the crater that possibly last for thousands of years, which does give molecules plenty of time to organize into complex structures, and once again provides all of the necessary conditions for life to start evolving. But once again, when it comes to these types of explanations, right now this is still very hypothetical. In other words, it's mostly based on mathematical models and theoretical predictions, not actual physical observations. Nevertheless, a lot of this research strengthens the theory that first of all, life seems to be a kind of a natural byproduct of planetary geology and chemistry, and can emerge in dark pressurized depths in various oceans, which is of course great news for astrobiology, because we might be able to find something similar in places like Enceladus and Europa, but it also tells us that the path to complex life is usually paved with collaboration, because these tiny Asgard microbes in Shark Bay remind us that even the smallest partners can eventually completely change the history of the planet. And so in essence, you and I are literally the result of a 2-billion-year-old friendship between two very unlikely species, a tiny microbe and some kind of an unusual archaea. And so what you're seeing here is not just some kind of a rock or some kind of a slime. This is literally an ancient home of the ancestors that made our existence possible. And assuming this is a universal phenomenon, something like this might have happened elsewhere. But importantly, we now have actual physical evidence that this is probably how complex life began. But on that note, if you want to find out more about Asgard Archaea or some of the other discoveries from the last few years, check out some of the previous videos in the description. We'll definitely come back and discuss this more in some of the future videos, but until then, thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support this channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining a channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.